Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has visited the Pacific island of Guam after North Korea threatened to strike the US territory, which is home to a major American military base. It follows remarks from President Trump in which he said North Korea would face what he called fire and fury if it attacked the US. Here's our North America correspondent, Nick Bryant.
A far-off American outpost in the tropical waters of the Western Pacific now finds itself at the center of a dangerous standoff. This is Guam, the site this summer of US military exercises, American territory that North Korea says could now be in the firing line. The warning was delivered on North Korean state TV. The chilling headline, Guam could be targeted by its medium to long-range rockets. And it came just hours after President Trump had threatened Pyongyang with some of the most incendiary rhetoric used by a US president in decades.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
And more tough talk on Twitter this morning. My first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal. It is now far stronger and more powerful than ever before. Hopefully, we will never have to use this power. But there will never be a time that we are not the most powerful nation in the world. On a refueling stopover in Guam, the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson used more soothing language. He said the island faced no imminent threat, that Americans should sleep well at night.
What the president was doing is sending a strong message to North Korea in language that Kim Jong-un would understand, because he doesn't seem to understand diplomatic language.
So why would North Korea target the tiny US territory of Guam? This small island is over 2,000 miles away from Pyongyang, but it's a critical strategic hub for the US military in the Pacific, home to 6,000 troops on 2 military bases, with a population of 160,000. This American paradise has been disturbed.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, immediately first, where is my family? To come up with a plan about if anything happened.
I'm not really nervous. I'm pretty confident in our military capability.
With the rhetoric already at such a perilous pitch, there's the danger that both sides become captive to their own tough words, that they talk themselves into a more serious confrontation. Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
It was on this day in 1945, as the US dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, that President Truman spoke of a reign of ruin. The bomb's code name was Fat Man. In what may be an uncanny or deliberate echo of that, 72 years later, Donald Trump threatened North Korea with a fire and fury response to Pyongyang's warning that it was considering carrying out missile strikes on the US Pacific territory of Guam. That threat followed reports that North Korea had managed to make a nuclear warhead small enough to fit inside a missile. And tensions between the two countries have been ratcheted up, as our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller reports.
If North Korean newscasters think they have a monopoly on shrill invective, threats to nuke their enemies and turn cities into a sea of fire, they may have met their match.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening, beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
NKTV hit straight back. The Korean People's Army, she said, was examining plans to envelop in fire the US Pacific territory of Guam. Pyongyang threatened all-out war to counter a preemptive strike. Just at that very moment, the US Secretary of State, had been headed to Guam, where he landed this evening. Earlier on the plane, Rex Tillerson had a keep calm message for Americans, who he said should sleep well at night.
North Koreans' rhetoric has just ratcheted up louder and louder and more threatening. So I think what the president was doing is sending a strong message to North Korea in language that Kim Jong-un would understand, because he doesn't seem to understand diplomatic language.
Kim Jong-un has shown little interest in dialogue in his headlong rush to acquire a nuclear-tipped ICBM, a deterrent to guarantee his regime's survival. North Korea has now launched a set of stamps to celebrate its latest triumph. Experts had thought the North still had some serious technical obstacles to overcome, but Trump's comments followed the leak of a US intelligence assessment that Pyongyang had now managed to miniaturize a nuclear warhead to fit onto a missile. If true, a great leap forward. Today, Trump's fire and fury remark was followed by 2 tweets. "My first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal," he said. "It is now far stronger and more powerful than ever before. Hopefully, we will never have to use this power," he went on. "But there will never be a time that we are not the most powerful nation in the world." The last time the US used its ultimate weapon was in August 1945 on Nagasaki. Today, Japan commemorated that bombing, which killed 150,000 people.
Tension is mounting when it comes to the international situation, and strong fears are spreading that nuclear weapons may be used again in the not-so-distant future.
The fiery blast of Trumpian bombast echoed President Harry Truman's warning of that Nagasaki bomb. "Accept our terms," Truman said, "or expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth."
The likes of which this world has never seen before. Thank you.
Today, North Korea staged a huge rally to reject the latest UN sanctions. Many around the world worry that in these volatile times, Trump's table-thumping is nothing short of mad. Pyongyang has the bomb, maybe as many as 60 of them. The threat of mutually assured destruction might yet prove the safest way to keep a dangerous peace.
Jonathan Miller reporting. Well, as we've heard, President Trump has tweeted that the US nuclear arsenal was more powerful than ever before and added, hopefully we'll never have to use this power. Inigo Gilmore is in Washington tonight. What's been the reaction there?
Well, as you would expect, Democrats have come out very, very strongly against what they see as Donald Trump's provocative rhetoric. One senior Democrat called the president bombastic and unhinged. From the Republican side, too, there's also deep concern. Senator John McCain said this was classic Trump, in that he overstates things and has to be able to back up his words with actions. But there's a lot of debate and anxiety here around what actions the president could or should take. The system is set up here in the United States so the president and only the president can decide when to launch a nuclear weapon. And historically, the idea behind this was to curb the power of overbearing generals. Now the worry is that these weapons are in the hands of a volatile president. So lots of questions today about who's advising President Trump and what they're briefing him. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has made a more measured statement now, still warning North Korea but calling for de-escalation. As for the other voices, General John Kelly is in his ear as his chief of staff. His national security advisor is H.R. McMaster, who'll be joining the president at his New Jersey golf club this week. And Vice President Pence will arrive tomorrow. So something of a working holiday war room, if you like, is taking shape. But as always, it's anyone's guess what Trump's next move might be. And I guess we may find out on Twitter.
And besides the threat of nuclear war, there's the matter of Russian election interference.
That's right, yes. We've just learned today that FBI agents have searched the home of President's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, in a morning raid that took place in late July. Now, Paul Manafort has been mentioned before in the Russia investigation story. His past foreign dealings have been looked at by those scrutinizing Russian interference in last year's elections. The use of a search warrant, we're told, suggests law enforcement officials have convinced the judge that there is a probable case that a crime has been committed. Now, Manafort's legal team, of course, say he has cooperated fully and denies any wrongdoing. This will be seen, though, as an intensifying pressure on Team Trump over an investigation the president still dismisses as a witch hunt, but which his critics say is closing in on his inner circle.
Well, earlier I spoke to Wendy Sherman, who was special advisor to President Clinton on North Korea and President Obama's Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the State Department. I asked her whether the rhetoric from North Korea and the US is ratcheting up tensions.
Well, I personally don't believe that's a great help. I don't think it's a great help when Kim Jong-un uses constant bombastic rhetoric, and after a while people stop listening to it. We all understand that President Trump has his own particular style, policy by tweet, as we say now in the United States.
The trouble is that the US Secretary of State says we can all sleep safely at night, yet the president is saying, or is threatening, violence the likes of which the world has never seen. I mean, who's got their finger on the button?
Well, indeed, I understand the concern of the international community. I've heard this as I travel around the world, because any war on the Korean Peninsula will be catastrophic and will affect the entire world's economy. So first and foremost, of course, the president has to defend the United States of America, but part of that is defending our economic security.
Couldn't you argue that the best way to make sure President Kim doesn't use his weapons is to make it absolutely clear to him that his country would be annihilated if he did?
Well, indeed, and I don't think that's lost on him. In fact, he has nuclear weapons because he believes the United States is a hostile power that could obliterate him. I think the tack that was being taken when we got the UN Security Council resolution 15-0 was a way to say this is a responsibility of the United States, but of the world community as well. China, Russia signed on. We need to pursue that, not only all of United States government strategy, but all of the world strategy to get North Korea to come to its senses. China needs to use its considerable leverage, and I've been very glad to see some of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's statements to the effect of how serious this is and that they will enforce them. The United States government needs to do what we did in the case of Iran, which is send teams out around the world, our ambassadors, though we don't have them everywhere yet here because of the process here in this country. Sanctions alone will not stop North Korea's nuclear program, but it might help focus their minds and understand the choices they have to make and get them to the negotiating table in seriousness.
Well, you helped deliver the Iran deal, and you began negotiations to some degree with North Korea as well. I mean, why do you feel the previous administration wasn't able to deliver more with North Korea?
It's been difficult for President Bush and President Obama and now President Trump. So no one says this is an easy feat, but we've never used all of our tools all at the same time in a sequenced and effective way. I know that President Obama tried his very best. I think we need to even push harder than were done during the Obama years. I think that President Trump could do that, and I hope that he does.
I mean, why not? Why wasn't it done?
Well, a lot was done, and a lot was done quite quietly. Towards the end of the Obama administration, I know after I had left government, indeed, they had sent teams around the world quietly to cut off financial avenues. But the United States does not have all of the leverage in this instance. We had much more leverage in the case of Iran, economically in terms of sanctions and correspondent banking relationships with the United States, because Iran engaged in trade with the entire world. North Korea uses more criminal kinds of conduct and corruption to get where it needs to go. China has the economic leverage, so we really need to work on that relationship in very quiet ways, to work with China to get to the right place here, and every other government in the world to take action.
Why does anybody think China would help the West, given it is really in China's interest to keep Kim Jong-un in power?
Well, actually, I don't believe it is in China's interest to keep Kim Jong-un in power. It now has very significant economic relationship with South Korea, with Japan, with the rest of the world. China is certainly a rising power in the world, is trying to be part of the international system and the international rules of order. And I don't think it's in China's long-term interest. Indeed, the last nuclear test that North Korea conducted was on the border with China and put at risk Chinese citizens.
A lot of people are looking at what's going on and feel like we're traveling back in time, as though we need to once more be afraid of nuclear war. Are you afraid of nuclear war yourself?
Well, I think that the reason for nuclear weapons is only worthwhile, if worthwhile at all, as a deterrent. President Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize for laying out an agenda to have a world without any nuclear weapons at all. In the old days of the Soviet Union, there was mutual ensured destruction, which kept both the United States and the Soviet Union from using those nuclear weapons. I think the 5 major nuclear powers that set up the non-nuclear proliferation treaty understood that these should not be seen as offensive weapons at all, but rather as deterrents, and there has been a commitment by everyone to try to build down those weapons. President Obama said it probably wouldn't happen in his lifetime, but it was a goal and objective we should all endorse.
Wendy Sherman, thank you very much.
Mixed signals tonight in the tense standoff between the United States and North Korea. US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis told Pyongyang to avoid actions that could usher in the end of the regime and the destruction of its people. Secretary of State Tillerson stood by Donald Trump's pledge to respond with fire and fury if North Korea continues to threaten the US, but said no such threat exists tonight. He visited the US Pacific territory of Guam, which North Korea said it saw as a target, as President Trump tweeted about the power of America's nuclear arsenal. Neither side seems willing to back down in what it is hoped will remain a war of words.
America's chief diplomat in the eye of the storm. A refuelling stop in Guam, also a chance to calm down the rhetoric.
What the president was doing is sending a strong message to North Korea in language that Kim Jong-un would understand, because he doesn't seem to understand diplomatic language.
Item 129, first ignition to missile.
Although military drills tend to intensify in the summer months, just last week the US test-fired its own long-range missile. The bellicose language being employed by both sides is new.
They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
There was no sign the president was regretting yesterday's remarks, the latest warning coming via Twitter. My first order as president was to renovate and modernize our nuclear arsenal, adding, there will never be a time that we are not the most powerful nation in the world. In response, North Korean television hit back with a threat to envelop the US military base at Guam in fire. One of the most respected Republicans, Senator John McCain, head of the Armed Forces Committee, gave this advice via social media.
This is a very complex and difficult issue, and I believe that my hero, one Teddy Roosevelt, once said, "Walk softly but carry a big stick," and that's not what's being employed here.
Trump's words, spoken before a drugs briefing, are believed to have been improvised, uttered without consulting advisors. But today, the administration insisted the strong language was intentional.
The president spoke to him, to Kim Jong-un, in a language that Secretary Tillerson has said, and said this morning, in the kind of language that Kim Jong-un will understand. We would like to see results. The pressure campaign, we see that working.
When President Trump left for his summer break, the body language looked combative. But few would have predicted his bombastic style would have led so directly to this foreign standoff. Juliet Bremner, News at 10, Washington.
The strategic importance of Guam to the Americans is no secret. It's the closest US territory to North Korea, and almost a third of it is taken up with military bases. North Korea's ability to attack it is less certain. But at just over 2,000 miles from Pyongyang, it's close enough to take seriously the military threat.
US commanders have described Guam as America's permanent aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Bombers and submarines equipped to deliver nuclear warheads are based on the remote island. If America was to strike against North Korea, its military based here would almost certainly be involved. That makes this island a potential target for a renegade regime whose threat had local television making some uncomfortable calculations.
Guam at the center of it all today. It would take 14 to 15 minutes for a missile launched from North Korea to reach us here in the territory.
Guam's governor said America wouldn't allow that to happen.
An attack or threat on Guam is a threat or attack on the United States. They have said that America will be defended.
Guam is a 210 square mile sovereign US territory in the Pacific Ocean, about 1,600 miles from Japan and 2,000 miles from North Korea. The island is within range of an estimated 30 to 60 medium and long range North Korean missiles. The US has a naval base and Coast Guard station in the south and an Air Force base in the north. It's home to 6,000 military service personnel and already has an American defense system designed to shoot down ballistic missiles. For today's threat from Pyongyang is nothing new. Occupied by Japan until the surrender of the Imperial Army at the end of the Second World War, Korea was then divided. The communists in the north, supported by Russia, fought the American-backed south. Ultimately, despite dreadful losses, neither side won. Ever since, there's been tension, with an increasingly isolated north building up its forces to threaten its neighbour. Experts believe North Korea spends up to 25% of its GDP on its military, one of the world's largest, with more than 1 million soldiers. It has 3,500 tanks and more than 500 combat aircraft. The reclusive states carried out 5 underground nuclear weapons tests, the first in 2006, the latest last year. Last month, it test-launched what it claimed to be 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles. As both sides made a very public show of practicing war, North Korea's leader threatened his enemies with a sea of fire.
What we're seeing here is President Trump matching the rhetoric with fire and fury rather than sea of fire. And it will be interesting to see if in doing that, he's able to create enough sense of unease within North Korea that they start to back down.
On the island of Guam, inhabitants, military and civilian, will be hoping the language of 2 unpredictable leaders is just a negotiating strategy. Paul Davis, News at 10.
North Korea's belligerent foreign policy is directed by a man we know very little about. Kim Jong-un was raised and educated almost entirely in secret, leading some to wonder if he could hold on to power once his father had died. But those who opposed him didn't last long, giving him a reputation as a deadly as well as a reclusive leader.
Donald Trump has described him as both a madman and a smart cookie. Others have labelled him a fool, a crazy fat kid, and by the Chinese he is called Kim Fatty III. Kim Jong-un, a leader ridiculed by the world, but apparently revered by his people. When he came to power in 2011, at the age of just 28, he was the 3rd in a family dynasty. His father, Kim Jong-il, a dictator remembered for turning North Korea into a nuclear state. But it was his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, who inspired his devotion to developing the weapons program. They bear a strong physical resemblance, which he uses to his advantage, copying his grandfather's leadership style, and like him, his speeches are a monologue of bombastic declarations.
이게 자주화를 실현하기 위하여 적극 노력할 것입니다. 우리 공화국은 책임 있는 핵.
On our last visit to Pyongyang, we filmed in a nursery where the children merrily sang his name. Young boys and girls brought up to celebrate his military prowess. They will be unaware of the hundreds executed on Kim Jong-un's orders, including his uncle, who was killed by firing squad, and half-brother, who was assassinated with a nerve agent. Both were deemed a threat to his regime. Educated in Switzerland, he is known to have a passion for basketball and a taste for cheese, which is to blame for his weight issues. Kim Jong-un, once dismissed as a figure of fun, has the devotion and the determination to finish what he started. A paranoid, power-hungry 34-year-old who has the world worried about his next move.
In a moment, we'll speak to Juliet Bremner in Washington. But first, back to Debbie Edward, who joins us live now from Beijing. Debbie, China's clearly a key player and in control of North Korean purse strings. So what are they actually doing?
Well, China has been trying to position itself as a peace broker, but certainly today it appeared reluctant to enter the fray. All we got from the Chinese government was a short statement in which it appealed to all sides to try and reach a diplomatic solution. Behind the scenes, we're told the Chinese government is working very hard to try and get Kim Jong-un back round the negotiating table. But in recent years, relations between Beijing and Pyongyang have deteriorated, and that is why China has supported several rounds of UN sanctions which have severely cut back its own trade with North Korea. China still believes that by using those economic levers it can encourage Kim Jong-un to talk. But clearly today the only dialogue he was interested in was that high-stakes slanging match with President Trump.
And from Beijing to Washington and Juliet Bremner, incredibly strong language from Mr. Trump, but has he got the whole team on side?
Well, there's been a lot of criticism about the mixed messages coming from the White House, so there seems to be a definite effort now to try and get everyone to speak with one voice. After those claims that President Trump had been speaking off the cuff when he spoke about fire and fury, we got a rebuttal from the White House almost immediately saying that his new Chief of Staff, General John Kelly, had known about the tone of the statement, just not the words. And that followed an earlier statement this afternoon from another former general at the Department of Defense, Secretary Mathis, who also appeared to have hardened his tone. He issued this statement saying that North Korea needed to stop its pursuit of nuclear weapons or realise that it could face the destruction of both the regime and its people. And he had been thought to be someone who favoured the diplomatic route, as had the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Now, both of them apparently slightly changing their tune to speak with that one voice, following in line behind their leader, taking this tougher language.
Juliet in Washington and Debbie in Beijing, thank you both.
President Trump didn't just shock the world last night with his words of fire and fury aimed at North Korea. He also shocked some of his advisers, apparently, as he was ad-libbing rather than giving agreed lines. That's according to the New York Times. But even before the president had spoken, North Korea had issued its own threat, saying the country is carefully examining a plan to strike the American territory of Guam. Just more words on their side, of course. At one level, you might worry that the words will run out and missiles will take their place. But you might ask why it's just words and not weapons yet. Could it be that both sides know their own limitations in any form of military conflict? Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, has been working through the logic.
American carriers exercising off Korea, but these pictures were taken in May and none are there now. The president seems out of sync with his military and his top diplomat, who today emphasized the defensive nature of US precautions.
I think what the president was just reaffirming is the United States has the capability to fully defend itself from any attack and defend our allies, and we will do so. And so the American people should sleep well at night.
Tillerson's in tune with generations of American statesmen who stuck to Teddy Roosevelt's maxim, speak softly and carry a big stick. But one reason he can be sanguine is because America's stick is not being brandished right now. America is not in a position to strike. Its only carrier in the area of Korea docked in Japan yesterday at the end of an operational tour. B-1 bombers in Guam may have got the North's attention, but while the US has a few dozen aircraft in range that could mount a limited strike, none of the broader preparations you'd expect are visible.
I don't think there's a credible military option for the US. To try and suppress North Korea's nuclear program would invite an unthinkable retaliation. To think that Seoul, South Korea's capital, is within artillery range of North Korea, to think that US bases are in the crosshairs, to think that allies who are very nervous at the moment are also in the crosshairs. And one of the problems Trump faces is that as belligerent and as inflammatory as his rhetoric gets, it's actually pretty difficult to use the stick.
And America's stick, even when brandished, is simply not as big as it used to be. It could still strike North Korea, and hard, but poor aircraft availability, reduced stocks of bombs and missiles mean readiness for a major conflict is poor. Add to that the vast size of North Korea's armed forces, presenting hundreds of thousands of possible targets, many pointing to the south, and America's ability to control any ensuing escalation is limited. And its defense secretary has said as much.
General Mattis has been public in the statements he's made about just how significant the military risks would be of going forward with any kind of preemptive strike, for example. And he's made those statements on the record, and he's talked about just how brutal any kind of military activity would be, how close Seoul is, for example.
So bereft of a big stick, or one that can be brandished credibly anyway, you'd think the president might moderate his tone.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
Why carry on with such language? Perhaps he's playing hard cop to China's soft, but at heart there is a reluctance to deal publicly with the fact that North Korea's nukes have fundamentally changed calculations.
The idea that North Korea's nuclear bomb is a reality, the idea that soon it will have the ability to deliver that bomb across the world, the idea that North Korea identifies that bomb with its own survival and will not give it up, well, voluntarily. That is a simple idea, but it's one of the most difficult ones to stomach because it offends the whole notion of America's uncontested global leadership and its deep commitment to inhibiting the proliferation of what it sees as rogue states.
With North Korea now threatening the US base in Guam, the war of words may have taken on a life of its own. Some de-escalation, at least verbal, is now vital.
Well, we'll assess the North Korean threat and the possibility of de-escalation shortly, but all of this has focused attention on Guam for unwelcome reasons. Guam itself is a petite, attractive island in the Pacific, around 6,000 miles off the coast of California. It's only about 25 miles long and 4 miles wide at its narrowest point. Almost a third of it is actually occupied by the US military. Population of about 160,000, has US citizenship, but Guam is not a US state. It was nabbed by the Americans from the Spanish in 1898. Apart from US military, tourism is one of its main industries for reasons that are quite understandable when you see the pictures. Well, the territory does not get to vote in US elections, but it does have a non-voting member of the House of Representatives. She is Madeleine Bordallo, and I spoke to her earlier about Donald Trump's handling of North Korea and how the people of Guam were feeling.
We're all very concerned. I'm concerned, and everyone on Guam. I'm one of these, I think, that we can solve everything diplomatically. Coming on with harsh words like the president did it's very dangerous to go through something like that. And I understand that maybe the North Korean leader did not even understand exactly what fire and fury means, and he reacted again. So this is no way to do it. I feel that we've been through threats with North Korea before. Our former president, Obama, had to deal diplomatically with this leader and other countries in the region, and it worked perfectly well. Now we've got a real threat. And, you know, people say, well, you know, people are calm on Guam. Well, we have a great number of military bases. We have 2 major military bases on Guam. And we have a large contingency of National Guardsmen. We have the THAAD missile defense operation there, which I was able to get a couple of years ago when these threats first came about. So we've been told by the military, by Secretary Mattis and Admiral Harris, that they were going to take good care of Guam if anything like this happened. And this was before the threat. So I'm putting my faith in that the military will take good care of Guam and its people.
You say Jim Mattis and the others of the defense establishment says to you on Guam, look, we'll protect you, we'll look after you, and you are not quite a part of the United States, but a territory of the United States. What's he promised? I mean, what can they do?
Well, for one thing, you say we're not part of the United States, but I feel even though we're an insular area, but we are a U.S. territory. And they have said, well, they're ramping up their military activity. You know, we have huge bases on Guam, and now already we are hearing that they're beginning to ramp up. And when they spoke to me, they always tell me, you know, of our close proximity to North Korea. So our island would be a very strategic area to ramp up military activity if a war broke out.
Does that THAAD, that missile protection system,
That's correct.
Does that work? Does that give you much, you know, safety? Give you a sense of security?
Absolutely, Evan. It's giving me the sense of security. They've been through a number of tests and briefings, and I understand that every one of the briefings has come out 100% accurate.
You say you don't like this kind of tough talking that's going on. I wonder what you think the Americans should be doing, because it is a problem, and it is going to be difficult to negotiate with Kim Jong-un. And indeed, they did try and negotiate with the North Koreans and persuade them not to have a nuclear program all those years ago, and they reneged on the deal. I mean, what is the approach that you would take?
Well, this is, you know, that was all the years ago. Now, it's now. And I don't know that this current president has done any negotiating with Kim Jong-un. And I don't know what kind of meetings have been set up and everything. But, you know, to comment about fire and fury and all that strong, it's just not making anybody comfortable in this part of the world. It's just, you know, the tensions are so, I mean, it's just wrapping it up. And I really think I've worked many years in politics, and I believe in the diplomatic way. And I think that talking out things can bring about a peaceful solution.
Congresswoman, thank you so much. Very good to talk to you.
You're welcome, Evan. You're very welcome.
Thank you. Madeline Bordallo of Guam there. So what should we make of the mixed signals we're hearing from the US, and where does this go? I'm joined by John Feiner. Now, until January, he was Chief of Staff for Secretary of State John Kerry as part of the Obama administration. Also with us is Peter Feaver, who held positions on America's National Security Council under both Presidents Bush in the 90s and 2000s. Evening to you. Jonathan Feiner, what would John Kerry be doing if he was Secretary of State now, do you think?
Oh, well, thanks, Evan. You know, he'd be the best person to answer this question, but I have to believe, as a big believer, Secretary Kerry is in the power of diplomacy and even diplomacy backed by force, but to achieve diplomatic objectives, that he'd be doing a version of what Secretary Tillerson has been doing and saying in recent days, making very clear that the very real consequences that would come to the North Korean regime if it continues down the path that it's on, while also sending reassuring signals to our partners and allies, and keeping open the possibility of a diplomatic process to try to de-escalate this confrontation, not rattling the saber with provocative statements in public.
But you did say you'd be telling them what would happen to them if they carried on. What would you say would happen to them, or what would he say would happen to them if they carried on?
Now, I think these deterrent messages, and because that's what this sort of messaging is about, it's about deterring bad behavior by the North Korean regime, are frankly best carried directly and privately, and not as well carried in a public forum where they can very easily be misinterpreted. Look, we spend a lot of time and energy, and Peter, I'm sure, can speak to this as well, trying to interpret some of the statements that come out of Pyongyang, much of which involves rhetoric that I think we choose to discount because it's so over the top, but much of which we just don't know how to really understand. Well, we're in a situation now that's very unusual for the United States, where we have our own administration, and not just anyone in our own administration, but our own president, making statements that are very difficult, not just for the rest of the world, or even for Americans to interpret, but much more of concern for the North Korean government to interpret. And that can lead to misunderstandings. Look, the only thing worse than choosing to go to war in this situation, which would have very real consequences to both sides, would be stumbling into a war that neither side wants.
Right. Peter Feaver, could there be strategy or clever tactics in this kind of rhetoric we had from Donald Trump yesterday, and the fact that it was rather different to the rhetoric from Tillerson? We have kind of like good cop, bad cop. I don't know what's going on, but is there something clever going on there?
Well, Evan, there are some plausible rationales. For instance, he could be saying, the president could be saying, we've tried 30 years of moderate rhetoric and it hasn't worked. Let's try a little sauce for the goose, because the language that the president used back against Kim Jong-un is the kind of language that you hear from North Koreans. It also could be the case that he's trying to rattle the Chinese, who fear very much this escalation spiral that John was talking about, and who have a lot of leverage over North Korea. And he could be trying to alarm the Chinese into taking tougher action in the economic sanctions front. But as was reported in the New York Times today, the president took his own national security team by surprise with this rhetoric. So it's clear that the team hadn't gamed this whole thing out and hadn't drafted this rhetoric. If there was that calculation, it was the president's own.
Peter, does confusion or mixed messaging or sort of utterly bewildering signals, does it ever have a place to play in dealing with an adversary?
Well, President Trump believes that the U.S. has been too predictable, and during the campaign he criticized President Obama for being too predictable that he would make concessions was Trump's point, and that as a negotiator Trump would be a little bit more unpredictable and would use that to his advantage. And there's the famous madman theory that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger are alleged to have developed, where Kissinger would meet privately with the foreign leaders and say, you know, you can trust me, but we don't know what President Nixon would do in a crisis, so you better make concessions. So there is some precedent for that, but as John pointed out, it's a very dangerous game to play, and it's best done if all of the team has gamed it out, has really thought through the strategy.
Look, Jonathan, you mentioned this risk of a miscalculation that causes a stumble, a mistake into kind of conflict. Just talk us through what that scenario would be. Just describe how that could occur, worst case, so to speak.
Sure. I think there are two dangerous scenarios for the United States in the category of miscalculations. You know, the president, as Peter said, is a proponent of this theory of strategic ambiguity, but that only works if there's a strategy behind it. In other words, if the ambiguity is an attempt to actually achieve an outcome and there is a plan to implement on and take advantage of the ambiguous situation the president has created. The risk, on the other hand, is that the president makes these very menacing statements, and either the North Koreans say, that's just bluster, that's just talk, continue down the path that they're on, call the president's bluff, and then the credibility of the president's threats is diminished dramatically. Or, on the other hand, the North Koreans take what the president is saying too seriously, too literally, and believe that he is on the cusp of launching a preemptive attack and decide that it's in their best interest to move first. And then you end up again in this category of potentially a conflict that neither side wants, because it's in neither side's interest to go to war, and yet it happens anyway. Those are the situations I think that we're worried about.
Understood. Peter Feaver, at this stage, what is the best way to de-escalate this and just sort of settle it all down, calm the nerves, and get back to where we were 3 years ago?
Well, there's two things that are concerning about where we are right now. First, the administration has said that it's intolerable that North Korea possesses a nuclear weapon. Well, they already do possess a nuclear weapon, and so that kind of language declaring what is already a fact to be intolerable backs the president into a corner. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the president in his threat yesterday, threatened North Korea with more if North Korea continued to make verbal threats. Well, verbal threats is the daily activity of the North Korean government. I think he would have been wiser to narrow it down to particular behavior, perhaps behaviors like tests or missile launches. And so the president may have backed himself into a rhetorical corner.
Peter
the best thing that could happen now is...
I need to leave it there, I'm afraid. Peter Fever, Jonathan Feiner, thank you both very much indeed.